So let's talk about the top 5 gym cell copes. Number 1 is the idea that short hair is masculine. So hair is literally one of your biggest health indicators. And when you shave your head, you basically just become extremely unattractive, right? Because in nature, if you have, a bald head or just really short hair, then it basically shows that you're not healthy, right? Because having long, thick hair is one of the biggest signs of health. And it's also one of the things that make you contribute to your attractiveness the most. Obviously, face height and frame matters as well, but hair is definitely up there. And short hair, right, does not make you masculine. In fact, short hair is quite literally for slaves because, back in the day with the slaves, they would shave all their hair, whereas the kings or just the high status people, they get to have longer, thicker hair. And this idea of short hair being masculine basically comes from the military, right? Because people think that, because they have shaved heads and they're from the military, that they're really tough. And that's where that association comes from. But you can also argue that soldiers, right, in the military, some might argue that they are kind of slaves, right? Some might argue for that because they're basically just, fighting and dying for the government. Now, you also have to know that it's a difference between cultural masculinity and biological masculinity. Because cultural masculinity, right, this idea that you need to have short hair, you need to die in a war, you need to provide all these things, this cultural idea of masculinity, those are all man-made ideas, right? All of those are man-made. Whereas true masculinity is biological masculinity that comes from, nature and our biology, which involves, height, frame, your bones, having biologically high testosterone, and of course, long, thick, healthy hair as well. So that's the first cope, that short hair is masculine. Second cope, and this was a real comment I got, is that lifting to look good is gay. And if you think to look good is gay, then honestly, that's probably even more gay, right? Because if you think lifting to look good is gay, right? I'm just using this picture as an example, then you're probably just lifting to be strong to impress other men. And that seems a lot more gay to me, right? If I have to be honest. And also the whole purpose of gym selling or just training in the gym in the first place is basically to compensate for your bones and your genetics, right? This is a brutal truth, but hypothetically, right, if during development from, when our mothers were pregnant and we had proper nutrition, right, like organs, meat, blood, stuff like that, and we've had that all the way until we're 18, we would be maximally developed to our genetic potential in terms of height, frame, your bone structure, and stuff like that. But the whole reason of lifting is that we didn't achieve our potential through that, right? We didn't achieve our genetic potential through, height and frame because we've all been cucked by the psyop of modern nutrition where we're eating grains and stuff like that. But right, the point of gym selling is basically to build muscle to compensate for your skeletal structure and your frame, right? To look good. If you're not training to look good, then you're literally just training to impress other men or lift weights for no reason, right? That's the whole sport of powerlifting. It's literally to see who can pick up the most metal and then whilst harming your body and looking like absolute shit. And in fact, a lot of this modern gym cell culture, it's basically you're basically a slave, if I have to put it that way, right? I don't want to sound like a goat cell, but right, the idea of shaving your head and lifting heavy weights and then eating a bunch of grains for carbs, you're basically acting like a slave, right? At least when you're lifting, right? Admit that you're lifting to look good, to compensate for your bones, right? That's like at least being honest. But if you're just lifting to be strong, then you're literally just only doing it to impress other men, and you should stop coping as well. Next thing, right? This ties into, lifting to look good is gay. It's that you need to use barbells for strength. And that is not true, right? If you use barbells, right, with a barbell squat, it'll make you better at barbell squatting. But in terms of actual brute strength, right, pure motor unit recruitment, it's not going to be as good as a machine. Because if you do a hack squat or a leg press, or even a Smith machine squat, which is a bit less stable but still more stable than the barbell, you're basically getting a lot more stability. And with more stability, you're getting a lot more motor unit recruitment. And if you get more motor unit recruitment, you're going to be able to develop more strength in terms of raw strength. Now, if you use barbells, right, like a barbell back squat, you're going to be better at barbell back squatting, which, if you're doing it for the sake of powerlifting, then sure. But most of us watching here, we don't plan on competing in powerlifting. And if you don't plan on competing specifically in the sport of powerlifting, then there's no specific reason that says you have to do the barbell back squat. And in fact, for most of us, doing stable machines just for hypertrophy is going to be the way better option. And next one, right? Since we're talking about legs so much, this one's actually something I've been talking about for a long time, but it's this idea that you have to train legs because it's functional. And thing is, for a lot of people, right, especially if you just focus on, squatting and deadlifting a bunch of weight, having legs that are too big could actually really mess up your physique, right? I have a picture of Will Tennyson here as an example, because in the bodybuilding space, right, there's the old school bodybuilding versus modern bodybuilding. But in the old school bodybuilding, there's this concept of the V taper, where you just have a V-shaped torso, but when it comes to the legs, you basically have legs that stay in line with the hips, right? I have some lines that represent this. Whereas in modern bodybuilding, there's the concept called the X frame, where you also have the V-shaped upper body, but when it comes to the lower body, you basically just have legs, specifically quads, that are so big that they actually sweep outwards, and it creates a whole X shape. The problem with training legs to this extent, where you just focus so much on quads, is that basically end up like this, right? You basically have quads that are so big that they actually make your whole lower body look wider, right? They make your whole lower body sweep out wider. And when you have legs that are wider, right, the whole lower body is wider like this, it basically makes your upper body look more narrow, and it creates this like almost like an upside down triangle shape, especially if you don't have a really good V taper in your upper body, right? If you especially if you have narrow frame, then you should be very careful when it comes to training your legs, specifically the quads and adductors, because the quads sweep outwards like this and the adductors sweep inwards like this, right? The quads and adductors basically develop laterally, and they will make your whole lower body look wider, and make your upper body look more narrow. If you want to train legs, right, you can actually focus on the hamstrings and even the glutes, right? But mainly the hamstrings and glutes and calves, you can really train those as much as you want, and they're never going to sweep outwards and ruin your V taper. But specifically when it comes to the quads and adductors, that's where you have to worry the most. And if you see that in the mirror that your quads and adductors are getting too big, for the sake of your physique, it should be in your best interest to either lower the training volume or just stop training it and let it atrophy a little bit. And in the meantime, you can focus on like hamstrings and glutes and deadlifts if you still want to train legs. Now, last thing, this is a bit brutal, but trying to compensate for your frame with muscle. And this is the way that you should look at frame, right? And frame just means your skeletal structure. For everyone's skeletal frame, your skeletal structure is like the base and the limiter of your physique. So if you're taller, you have a wide frame, and you have long limbs, then you basically have a greater base even before you start training. And you also have a greater limit, right? Your cap. Because for everybody's skeletal structure, you basically have a sweet spot for your frame. And the sweet spot is basically the amount of muscle that will look best on your frame. So if you look at someone like this, where they have a smaller frame in general, and especially shorter limbs, right? If you have short limbs like this, then you basically have a much lower sweet spot, because you're gonna fill out your frame really quickly, and anything after that, you're just gonna look really weird like this guy. And same with this guy, right? You basically have a small frame, then your the sweet spot at which you get the most benefit, it's gonna be lesser. Whereas if you're like this guy, where you have a wide frame and you have really long limbs, if you have long limbs, then you can basically just keep training for a long time, and you're always going to look better and better and better, because you're filling out your frame. But again, if you have short limbs and a small frame, then you might tap out to your sweet spot in only a few years, and anything after that is just going to make you look worse. So what was I going to say? So yeah, if you have a small frame, going past your sweet spot, it's only going to make you look weird. And honestly, if your average height and frame, right, let's say you're 5'10", 5'11", and you have an average size frame, in maybe around 4 years of proper science-based training, even if you don't have that good genetics from building muscle, you can get pretty close to your sweet spot. And that's why I think roids is actually not that necessary if you have an average height or frame, right? If you're really tall, like 6'2", 6'3", and you're really lanky, then sure, roids might be beneficial. But if you're average height and frame, you probably don't need steroids, right? You can get really good results in 3 to 4 years. And maybe if you want to use steroids to grow your frame or HGH to grow your frame, I have a few people in my Discord server who are using growth hormones, HGH, to try and grow their frame. Um, but yeah, that's the fifth point, right? Trying to compensate for your frame with muscle. You basically have a sweet spot, and anything after that is just going to make you look worse. So once you get to your sweet spot, you might as well just don't make yourself look worse. And yeah, private Discord server, link in the description. I have exclusive content, workout routines, guides, all that good stuff. Go check it out. See you in the next video.